It was just one of those things where when the unit got attacked, it was my first unit. I had all these experiences, I had all these thoughts, and I knew for a fact that no one was going to be held accountable. And I just really felt there was a moral obligation and it was important enough to address it. One of the hardest parts was my mental health being attacked through this. And so when somebody attacks your mental health, it's like anything you say is negated, because if you're crazy, anything you say doesn't matter because you're crazy, right? You can't take back the 13 service members that were killed over there based on just a terrible plan relying on the Taliban for security. But what you can do is prevent the next thing that we can get out ahead of by addressing the shortfalls at the operational and strategic levels.
We, the people, want accountability. We want accountability from our media to deliver information, not tell us what to think. We want accountability from our school systems to educate, not indoctrinate. We, the people, want accountability from our physicians to treat, to do no harm, not act as government agency arms serving an agenda or big pharma representatives. We, the people, want accountability from our leaders, both elected and, even more importantly, unelected leaders. Welcome to KLIM.news. That's Kristi Leigh, Independent Media. I am Kristi Leigh, and our guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller, and he's asking for accountability, truth, and transparency. And for that, he's been punished and silenced. Welcome in, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller. So this all hit the ground when you decided to speak out, and I've heard some of your other interviews. That was a struggle for you, and just take me through your story and how this all came to be.
Sure. So I'm an infantry officer. I served in the Marine Corps for 17 years. I have served all across the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, and I have studied and thought about foreign diplomacy and counterinsurgency and everything that we've been doing for the last 2 decades. So in the fallout of Afghanistan, it was very personal to me. I have a unique insight into all the things that I've done, and I felt a moral obligation to speak out, and I did that through a video that I posted, and it turned into a series of escalating events that ultimately culminated with me in jail. But I still, looking back, feel very strongly about the message that I put out, and that's why I'm still talking to anyone that'll listen, because I still think there are fundamental changes that need to occur, not only in the military, but military has mostly been my focus, but I also feel like there's a political responsibility to help us hold the military accountable. And so for all those reasons, I'm still engaging the conversation.
Now, I'm a former longtime news anchor that decided to leave the mainstream because I just felt like it was filled with lies. Obviously, that wasn't met with welcome from some colleagues of mine, former colleagues. And so you kind of go through this period when you speak out of getting attacked and lies being told about you. And many of the people I interview are in the same boat, that there are people in their circles that decide to speak out about something that they're not unhappy with. Now, as far as I can tell, you have an exemplary record. What are some lies that are being perpetrated about you right now?
I think right now that I'm able to get off the gag order and speak, that the narrative has kind of gotten clarified. And I think most people understand where I'm coming from. But during the event, it's very tough as a service member when you're under a gag order and the institution can run a narrative that you can't address publicly. And so that was what was happening to me. The military also ran an investigation where it was not objective, it was very subjective, and it was just a lot of personal attacks. I think mostly because people were scared and hurt at the things that I was saying. No one really was addressing the content of the statements. They were just attacking me personally, which was hard to deal with. But, you know, as you said, we're in a polarized world right now. And even the media, I've had a hard time getting on some of the liberal stations that covered my story. And I just want to engage everyone. This has never been political for me. These are foundational organizations that have problems that we need to address, and we need to be able to do it as a United States and have conversations on both sides of the political spectrum. And so your question was, what are some of the lies that were told about me? You know, specifically, I was painted as a violent extremist. I was painted as a right-wing extremist. And I just factually, none of that was true. And it took a while for me to kind of bring the narrative back to, hey, this is about America. This is about us. These are key issues that affect all of us, no matter what your political ideology might be.
Now, you talk about it being polarizing and being painted as a right-wing extremist, but you also got some backlash for speaking out against President Donald Trump. Can you explain to me why you decided to also take that route? And do you feel like his pullout strategy would have been any better or just the same?
I think President Trump did a lot of things very well in the foreign diplomacy realm. When I made the comments against President Trump, I also made comments against the last 4 presidents. And so you got to understand everything I just said. People were painting me as a right-wing extremist. And I wanted to point out that I had problems with the system holistically. And so I went through all presidents, issues with all of them. But the media only ran with the comments that I made about President Trump. And President Trump even contacted a member of my team because he, the story that was ran was that I was speaking out against President Trump and not against all the other presidents because I was speaking against the system. And he almost came out publicly and defended himself against the comments that I made against him. And a member of my team spoke to him and asked him to have restraint, and he did. And so I publicly thanked him for that. I mean, he demonstrated character that he's not often portrayed with, and it was very important to me. And so I think where we can get back on track as Americans is figuring out what we have in common. And I think I have a lot in common with Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean I agree with him on everything. And so I think as long as we can tell truth and come to some common understanding of things that need to change, specifically in the military 4-star combatant command level, at the operational level, through the national security level and the strategic policy level, where we're losing wars consistently, no one is addressing those problems. And that is really what the whole focus of my message has been.
Now, you talked about being released from your gag order. When did that happen, and how were you able to finally speak out?
I was on a gag order almost from September to the day I got out, December 24th. And I violated it at one time, and they sent me to jail, and I still remained silent. And up until when I got my discharge back, I actually made a couple more posts challenging the gag order again. And at that point, they were just done fighting with me, and they expedited my exit. So instead of getting out in the middle of January, once my discharge came back, they had me out within 4 days, and I got out on Christmas Eve. So the day I was released was when the gag order was no longer legally valid, if it was ever legally valid in the first place.
And you were honorably discharged, or what was the stipulation with that?
This is a good question that I haven't really had the opportunity to address. So in the matter of my plea deal, I agreed to plead guilty to 5 charges, submit a resignation, and then the government would determine if it was going to be an honorable or a general under honorable. So once I got out, we went through the court-martial process. Then it came down to the discharge characterization. All the general officers and the commandant recommended general under honorable. But I truly assumed that once it went up to the Secretary of the Navy, because according to the policy, if my service up to that point is so honorable, that he should be giving me an honorable. So I wrote him a letter stating the regs and asking him to look at that. And they didn't even route my letter. Like, they buried my letter where I pointed out, like, legally why I should be given an honorable. And then the Secretary of the Navy, he got so many phone calls. I mean, it was probably one of the biggest issues that he's ever addressed. They had to set up a task force to answer the phone calls. He refused to endorse the discharge, which I can't think of another case where if there's one where he should be personally involved, it would be that. But he had his Undersecretary of the Navy endorse it so that he wouldn't have to deal with it. And the Undersecretary of the Navy just took the recommendations of the generals in the Marine Corps. And so they gave me a general under honorable, which is less than honorable, but it is what it is, and it allows me to start moving forward in my life.
Wow. I mean, there's just so much corruption at play. I mean, the fact that he would just want to push that off, even though that was something that he should have listened to, especially precedential wise, it sounds like it would have been the more legal route to give what you were asking.
I mean, it could be better. So when they buried my letter arguing for an honorable, I did what's called request mass. It's the formal process to address an issue. And so I addressed, like, hey, I know for a fact you didn't submit this because my lawyer knows the people at headquarters of Marine Corps and they didn't have it. And so I would like a reason why you didn't submit it. And they refused to acknowledge my request for mast because they quoted a legal order that stated they don't have to address something when somebody's going through a discharge. And he wouldn't even give me the face-to-face to discuss it. He sent back a piece of paper that said that. So here's a guy who's fighting for a discharge for his entire life's work. The letter isn't even routed, and when he asked to discuss it, they wouldn't even discuss it with me. I mean, it's crazy.
It's unbelievable. And now but you love the military. I mean, like you said, it's your life's work. You believe in it. But where were you starting to see some problems and some frustrations? When did that happen?
I've probably had ideas of frustration since all my deployments. But as a young officer, when I joined, I just wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be a leader. I wanted to be challenged. I wanted to experience combat, all of these things. And so you see these things that you start to question, and it's just one of those things that accumulates over time. Then you go to higher level education, you get a master's, you start writing theses on these topics, and it just really starts developing your thought process. So it took, people still ask, like, well, why now? Like, you've been doing this, and there may have been problems all the way since then. And I don't know if I agree with that argument. Like, you're not always as wise as you are after a lifetime of work and research and study. So yes, was there problems in 2003? Absolutely. But 23-year-old Stuart Scheller wasn't insightful enough, wasn't educated enough, wasn't experienced enough to talk through all those things. And this had nothing to do with President Biden being the president. If this exact situation had played out under a Republican president, I would have done the exact same thing. And so it was just one of those things where when the unit got attacked, it was my first unit. I had all these experiences. I had all these thoughts, and I knew for a fact that no one was going to be held accountable. And I just really felt there was a moral obligation, and it was important enough to address it.
And that's, I think, what, like I said in the beginning, we're all asking for accountability in so many different areas, and it seems so important that our first line of defense, our military we should trust that there's accountability there. Now, what was the straw that broke the camel's back, though, if you will, that made you do that first video? You said it was deeply personal to you.
So as Afghanistan was unraveling, you're watching it real time in the news and media. So there was a 2-week buildup of where I was watching it, and I was getting very frustrated. I was talking to my wife about it. I was talking to my friends. And then a week previous to August 26th, the commandant released a white letter that didn't address the failures of leadership. So he was addressing why everyone was upset. And his diagnosis of the problem was, he didn't really even diagnose the problem. He just stated, your sacrifices were worth it. If you need help, go seek counseling. And that letter actually made me much more angry, because I felt like maybe my senior leaders didn't even understand the true pain that service members were going through and why they were upset. They were upset because senior leaders at the operational through the strategic level were failing. No one is arguing that we should have remained in Afghanistan. I quite honestly don't think we should have been there as long as we were, which are still breakdowns at the operational and strategic level. But after so many service members have sacrificed so much for 2 decades, at a minimum, there should have been a sound plan in the withdrawal to make sure that we didn't leave hundreds, really, by their own admission, hundreds of Americans, but it turned out it was thousands of Americans. And you asked what was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was August 26th was the attacks. I was sitting in my office. I know all the guys in 1-8. It was my first unit. When I was in 1-8 in Ramadi, I got hit. My best friend got hit with a suicide vest, and it was very personal for me. And I sat in Walter Reed with him. And so here was another suicide vest attack on the same unit. And I made the video because I felt it was so important that we discuss that. But I understood the implications to myself and my career. I didn't post it right away. I went home and I was pacing, and I just was really struggling if it was worth it or if I would actually make any change. But I just came back to the thought of how important it was, and we talk about moral courage all the time. And so I made the decision to post it.
Now, you talk about your relationships. How has you speaking out affected your relationships as much as you feel comfortable sharing with your family, with your friends, with those you served with?
One of the hardest parts was my mental health being attacked through this. And so when somebody attacks your mental health, it's like anything you say is negated, because if you're crazy, anything you say doesn't matter because you're crazy, right? So I was dealing with that. The second thing that was probably the toughest to deal with was all the things that my friends said, that, these are guys that I've hung out with, grew up with through the Marine Corps, and to have them say some of the things they said was just deeply troubling. And then you alluded to it. I went through a divorce going through the ordeal. No negativity there. There's a lot of things that I could do better. I mean, she's the mother of my children still. She's been with me my whole career. And, I still have a lot of love for her. But this situation illustrated that I was on a path that potentially she wanted something else. And so it's just been tough. My whole life was upended. I lost all my friends, going through a new situation with my family. And then the organization that I loved, I was quickly expedited out. And so you see all this, and then you ask yourself, was it worth it? I don't think I would do anything different going back. Like maybe that's a little untrue. There's things I would have changed in how I said it or how I conducted it to make it more effective. But the core message of senior leaders are failing at the operational and strategic level. They're not addressing the real problems. That needs to be discussed. It's still not being discussed, and I'm the only one that's still going out there and talking about it. Yes, there was a lot of people right in the aftermath that wanted to address it, but they've all moved on to the next thing. And the problems that still fundamentally exist in the military are not being addressed by anyone else. And so you can't take back the 13 service members that were killed over there based on just a terrible plan relying on the Taliban for security. But what you can do is prevent the next thing that we can get out ahead of by addressing the shortfalls at the operational and strategic levels.
Okay, and so you don't regret maybe just some of the things that you said, but you don't regret the decision to come out. One thing that I've talked about or heard you talk about is just this concept that what you're demanding, more accountability for the upper leadership, is not something new, that even Abraham Lincoln fired generals. So where did it come to this point where those in the senior leadership are almost untouchable?
That is a great question. I don't know if I really have the answer. I can go back in time when it happened. It happened after World War II. Korea is kind of a weird example because Korea actually, maybe that's how the system was supposed to be designed. MacArthur had this great tactical landing at Incheon, and then he wanted to go north and use tactical nukes. And Truman, who was also a war veteran, told him no. So there's an example of a very varsity level general clashing against civilian control, and it actually all kind of worked out as it should have. But Korea also still had a lot of World War II veterans. But somewhere from Vietnam on, we got away from holding generals accountable. And the other thing you got to realize is when our founding fathers built our government, which you can read all the Federalist Papers outlining how the Constitution was designed, and then you got the Bill of Rights, but they didn't envision the military arm of foreign diplomacy to be what it is today. They thought that the military was going to be a domestic defense type thing, and that still kind of was prevalent in the Civil War. So when we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, yes, he was firing generals. Abraham Lincoln thought that generals would be the military experts, and he figured out through trial and error that that wasn't the case and had to fire multiple generals until he got to Grant, who, again, Grant was a tactical, not very good, but on the operational level, he had insight. And there's a lot of parallels to some of our generals there today. But what happened was after World War I, when Woodrow Wilson outlined the 13-point speech and America's new role in foreign diplomacy, and then after World War II, we literally built our national security arm from the ground up. So through the National Security Act of 44, 47, and then the follow-on Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 80s is really when we built our national security establishment. And so you ask when it started. In my opinion, when we built this new national security arm of the military post-World War II, that's where this new system kind of started losing its way within the government contracting world, not holding generals accountable. And we even tried to address it with legislation recently. Senator McCain tried to start a Goldwater-Nichols 2.0 conversation because even then, a guy with that type of military experience understood that the national security arm of the military arm of foreign diplomacy needed to be updated. But when they got together, no one could agree on how to change it. There was consensus that it needed to be changed, but no one could change it. And then once a guy like McCain passes away, the conversation just died. And so now we're in a situation where since Vietnam, we are not holding general officers accountable. And then the other part of it is post-Vietnam, we had this big backlash against the military. And since then, the American population has been conditioned that that's wrong and that they need to celebrate the military. And so in the celebration of the military, it's led to a lack of criticism. And based on that lack of criticism, the general officers in this new system have been protected, and no one is really pointing out where they are systematically failing.
So, I mean, all this to say, it sounds like you feel the military has become highly politicized itself.
Yes, I mean, there's definitely a part of that. There's a lot of just sound bites out there, people saying woke generals. I don't know if I completely subscribe to that. All generals love the United States, but they are absolutely influenced by the how to navigate their career. And in navigating their career, there are certain agenda items through politics that have to be important if they want to keep playing the game. And so once you get into the general officer ranks, you didn't join the military because you're a woke whatever, but as you figure out how to navigate the system, there's just certain things that you have to do that may not be what's in the best interest of the junior service member. But if you want to keep getting promoted, that's how you play the game. And so that problem exists early in the field grade officer up to the 4-star level. And you're conditioned that there are certain things that you have to do to play. And the military is different than the corporate world. In the corporate world, you can bring in fresh blood. You can bring a talented executive from somewhere else and put them in the CEO position. You can put them in the deputy position. In the military, you can't. In the military, it is literally built from the ground up, 0 to 40 years. And so when you get to 40 years, these guys have figured out how to navigate the system, and that may not necessarily be the best person to win a war.
Now, I've talked to other people in the military, like Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, and also Joe Kent, and they're been very supportive of you. One thing that they talk about is they feel like there's an active effort to purge patriots from the military. What is your take on that?
I don't know if I believe that. I think there's an active effort to purge the military of people that don't reflect the views of the current leadership, right? And so I think what they're trying to say is someone like myself who doesn't agree with certain positions currently in the military, those people need to be purged, and that you could call those people patriots. But we just got to be very careful about purging the military of people that have different views than the current leadership. Like, I'll just use my stance, for example. I think what I'm saying is 100% true. In fact, I think most people believe what I said was true. What they argued was the method with which I said it. And we got to be real careful about getting rid of people that are speaking blatant truths just because they don't like the way in which it was said.
The manner in which it was said. Right. So another thing that I've seen on a personal note is I have family members that are in the military right now that have been asking for religious exemptions to the vaccine. One of them was injured by the anthrax vaccine, and they are under constant threat, ridicule, getting singled out on certain things, and they don't know what their future is now. One of my family members has been in for 19 years. Do you have any thoughts on this coercing of military members to get this vaccination?
Kristi, you're bringing it. No one's asked me this question, and everyone looking at me with everything I've done has asked me that through the messages. What I'll say on the vaccine is the military absolutely legally discriminates, right? You can't go into the military if you're a diabetic. And so there's certain things that the military has to legally discriminate about. And vaccines, there's a lot of vaccines that you have to get when you come into the military. Now, this specific vaccine is obviously a unique situation, right? It got pushed through the legal process very quickly. And so the DOD did give a legal order to take the vaccine. But the question becomes, is it a legal order if it wasn't legally FDA approved? And so it's this very unique situation that is going to have to play out in the court systems. I have a lot of respect for the people who are saying, based on whatever reason, that they don't want to get vaccinated. But here's my real problem with it. It's not that the DOD gave an order to take it. It's that the people who decide not to take it, if the DOD feels it's a legal order and that it got pushed through legally, and that service members who don't want to take the vaccine need to be pushed out of the military, I can understand the position of the DOD. But to not give them an honorable discharge is ridiculous. So a lot of these people are not getting honorable discharges. The deal when these people came in wasn't involved in this vaccine, right? And the generals have to acknowledge that this vaccine is unique and got pushed through the trials very quickly. And so they have to also understand that there's hesitation amongst many people. The government has given them many reasons to be skeptical. I mean, that's all fair stuff. So if the DoD wants to hold the position that they have to get this vaccine, and that there are people, understandably, who don't want to get it, they should at a minimum be given an honorable discharge. And I just think it's criminal that they're not.
From my perspective, I'm interested in your perspective with you being in the military, but no one is telling the story of these military members that have had adverse reactions, to the point that I'm getting messages constantly. I've been added to an underground Facebook group because obviously they have to speak completely in code, otherwise they get shut down. And so I'm constantly, daily, weekly, getting stories of people that had gotten this virus, and then they feel that because they were forced into then getting the vaccine, which theoretically they wouldn't have needed because they had natural immunity already, that is when they have had terrible problems, some even having some minor paralysis issues, many of them having the clotting issues. So again, is it fair to single out our military, to be essentially not give them civil rights to choose what to put in their body, when we have a history of anthrax documented causing issues, and then we have a vaccine now that is not available? The fully FDA approved vaccine, Comirnaty, is still not available in the USA. So they're demanding and coercing and threatening dishonorable discharges, threatening retirement accounts and money based on a vaccine that is not available. It's all this emergency use authorization. So what is anyone going to speak up for these military members that are facing this right now?
Yeah, so you brought up anthrax, and since I'm on the interview, this is a good story to tell. So in September 11th, when the anthrax attack happened, the same thing happened. They pushed a vaccine on the military members because they legitimately thought there was an anthrax threat. And the way the anthrax shot worked was it was like 6 shots and then a booster. So I went through 5 of those shots. They lost my medical record. I had to start back over. I got like 4 or 5 more shots, and then they found my medical record. And then they said, "You've had like 11 of these.
Wow.
You've had way too much." And then you're right. They came out and said that the anthrax shot was not FDA approved, and it caused a bunch of medical problems. One of them is nerve problems. Some of the probably I have, I think, some symptoms from some of the stuff that I went through with the anthrax shot. So yeah, they're absolutely, like, again, going back to the DoD has to recognize why there are service members that might have trepidation and distrust based on just the track record. And so my hope would be there would be some compassion when looking at these service members and everything that they've sacrificed, just like you were talking about, 19 years in the military. But it is kind of a crazy time right now. Absolutely.
And so another thing I found surprising that just recently came out about you is that you are thinking about entering politics, which is interesting because you kind of speak against politics and how political everything has become, but then now you're talking about entering politics. So explain that.
You know, I really enjoy reading, writing, talking, thinking, but I also like to be a man of action. And so, you know, I thought real seriously about just starting a podcast, but I don't know if I can just be a guy that identifies the problems and doesn't take action to fix them. So that's my problem. And so when I got out, I never had any political ambitions, but just based on my platform, everyone was approaching me, wanting me to go into politics. And I told them no. And so I'm not going in the 22 cycle because everything you just said, politics was never my answer, but I am seriously looking at it for 24 just because everything I just said. I'm very passionate about foreign diplomacy. I'm very passionate about America. I love America. I love Americans. And I think that we need more leaders and not politicians. So it's easy for me to sit on the sideline and talk about the problems. It's harder for me to get active and make the changes that need to occur. And I'm a guy that likes bias for action. So for that reason, I think I've decided that I'm probably going to put my name in the hat in 24.
Are there any leaders that inspire you or that you would hope to emulate or really respect?
I mean, there's a bunch of examples in history, right? I brought up Lincoln before. I've read a bunch of Lincoln's memoirs or stuff that was written on him. And that guy going through everything that he wanted to, the struggle, even his wife was pro-slavery and he went against what his wife said. I mean, just the internal fortitude of that man, and then firing all the generals. Just a great leader. I think President Eisenhower and President Truman aren't studied enough. I mean, those guys, the things that they did, just truly brilliant leaders. And then in the military right now, we still have a ton of leaders. I know sometimes I can get bent into an anti-military, but I'm not anti-military. I'm very pro-military, and I think the talent that we have in the military is phenomenal, quite honestly. I mean, there's 1-stars like Worth, Wortman, Klingon. These guys I've all worked for that are they're all smarter than me. They're all more athletic than me, and I aspire to be like them every day. But again, the problem is the system of people navigating their career and trying to emulate the things that maybe senior politicians want out of their military that may not be in the best interest. So I worry about like those 3 guys, because they're talented enough that they're going to stick around for probably another 25 years to 4 stars, what that means for, how they have to represent themselves. And so I think there's a ton of good leaders out there. But again, sometimes they relegate themselves to the sidelines and don't get active. There's a lot of great articles out there identifying all the problems that I've already identified. But the problem is an article by itself does nothing. An article can only be effective if there's a leader out there that takes that information and turns it into action. And so, again, I think we need more action.
Who are you supporting right now politically? Anybody in particular?
I started a candidate coalition, mostly veterans. You can check it out at votesforvets.org. I've got 5 senators and 20 congressional reps that across the country I plan to support through the 22 election cycle. My goal is to get 5 or 6 up there with some key votes and start making change with some of the hard decisions that need to be made. And so most of them are conservative leaning, but if you go to my website, AuthenticAmericans.com, you can see my personal political views. I quite honestly think that the extreme right and extreme left have done a lot of damage to this country, and we're never going to agree on everything. But I think the center right and the center left might actually have more in common than with the extremes of their own parties. And so just making it a right or left thing, I think in that binary terms is not helpful.
I think it just plays into the hands of all of the division already. I hate the 2-party system, but we got to work with what we got, I guess, right?
Well, that's it, right? So, I mean, exactly like you just said. So you asked me what the candidates' backgrounds are. A lot of them are conservative, but if I had a central left candidate that was a veteran that I thought was a leader, I'd be absolutely willing to support him. Tulsi Gabbard just came out, and she's a previous Democratic congresswoman, and she said the exact same things that I'm saying, right? So I'm not going to say I don't agree with Tulsi Gabbard because she's a Democrat. No, what Tulsi Gabbard said was spot on, and I fully support her.
Well, I know our time is winding down. So how do you think, I mean, I think you've kind of addressed this, but how do we get out of this? Is there a way to get out of this? Is it going to take a long time? What do you see for the future?
Well, nothing happens quick, but I think the answer is through action. I think the answer is through leadership. And I think engaging the conversation in a healthy way and trying to intentionally find where there's similarities and not differences and allowing yourself to get pulled apart. I mean, I'll make a post on social media about unity and you'll see in the comments like people start attacking each other about their different views. And I typically just try and stay out of it, but it's like you guys are both missing the point. Mm-hmm. Like you both have valid points, but you're wanting to fight. And so I think if we can be just a little bit more tolerant, respectful, we can start to move in a direction that'll be healthy for the country.
What is the biggest message that you want people to hear right now? I mean, since there have been efforts to silence you, what do you want to, now that you don't have a gag order, really have people know and take away about you?
I have 2 goals. One, we need to bring accountability to the senior military ranks. So that's the general officer 4-star level at the operational through the strategic level. I think we start with the Afghanistan withdrawal. There is no better example in history of a failure, and that was General McKenzie. General McKenzie failed to advise the president effectively, and then when he was given the restraints of the plan, he should have assumed accountability, and he hasn't done so. So I think it should start with him, and then we can look across the board of how we hold military generals accountable. And then the second pitch would be, I think we need leaders, not politicians, up in D.C. And so going back to my example about Afghanistan, bipartisan Congress members took turns talking about how angry they were, and then after it, nothing happened. And within Congress, their one lever of control is the DoD budget. And what wasn't in the news was 6 days previous to all their sound bites of anger, none of them stood against the DoD budget. They just wrote a $740 billion blank check without asking for metrics of effectiveness or accountability, because that would have required courage. And so I think, just to recap, we need accountability in the senior general officer ranks, and I think we need leaders, not politicians, up in politics.
All right, very good. One last question, actually. I'm a person of faith. I feel like a lot of this has been a spiritual battle, and from what I gather, it's like something that you've been dipping your toe in, maybe, as far as discovering your spirituality or faith. Can you tell me anything about that?
I've always believed in God. I always believed that He whispers, but it's on you to take action. Right. So there's, I think, some signs out there that you can read into, whether that's a voice inside you or whether that's a higher power. I don't know. I'm just a guy. I'm trying to figure it out myself. I do think religion can be effective in discipline, but I've found sometimes in organized religion, people can become judgmental, which is the opposite of what should be preached. I think it should be about love, tolerance, and understanding. So I'm very spiritual. I believe in God. I grew up a Christian. But I just hold one arm's distance when I see hypocritical things in church. So when I go to church and the first thing they say is we're right and they're wrong, I take a step back.
So in the end, seek Jesus, not church.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know that you are kind of on a media blitz right now, so we do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And we'll be following you, and good luck in everything that you're trying to do right now.
Thanks, Kristi.